name is Nita Couchman. I'm the president of the Orcas Island Garden Club. I'm not going to say too much because we want to get on with our program, but I do want to share a little quote from Henry David Thoreau before we start our program today. He wrote, "Though I do not believe that a plant will spring up where no seed has been, I have great faith in a seed. Convince me that you have a seed there, and I am prepared to expect wonders." So enjoy the program today. And I'll pass it off to Dixie.
So thank you, Orcas Island Garden Club. Thank you, Orcas Island Library. Great. Okay, so I am grateful to our speaker because I don't know about all of you, but I've been seed cataloging it, getting ready to do wonderful things for the spring. So this comes at a really great time. So okay, so rather than to carry on, I'm going to continue trying to get my members up and going on this, but let's have the rest of the time be spent on learning how to do something with the seeds that we get from our seed catalog. All right, thank you all.
It's my pleasure to introduce Carol Miles. Carol Miles is a professor in the Department of Agriculture at Washington State University and is the horticulture specialist and interim director at the Washington State University Mount Vernon Northwestern Washington Research and Extension Center. She specializes in vegetable crop production as well as cider apple production and has a strong interest in alternative crops and organic production. Her current research program focuses on grafting melon and watermelon, sweet potato production for northern climates, tea propagation, and using soil biodegradable plastic mulch in vegetable and fruit production. Carol has her MS and PhD in vegetable crops from Cornell University. Many of us have been lucky enough to hear Carol in past presentations through different organizations. And we're so grateful for the expertise she shares with us. And today we're particularly grateful that she's allowing us to record this presentation so it will be there for others. Thank you, Carol. Welcome.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share. So this may take a couple of minutes. So bear with me here as we get going. And you're going to have to tell me what you see at your end because I see something a little bit different at my end. So please let me know if you can see the slides.
We can.
All right. Then I am going to just change my configuration here a little bit and bear with me again as I just work with my screen. We didn't have an opportunity to test this earlier, so I appreciate your patience here. All righty, there we go. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us today. I know it's been a little bit of a hassle to get on with us, but just remember it's a lot easier than catching a ferry that's running 30 minutes late. So that's the way I look at it. And so what I've been asked to talk to you about today is growing vegetable crops for seed production. So if you're growing vegetables and you want to save seed in your garden, at your house, that's what this presentation is targeted for. So it's kind of a lot of little information, and hopefully it all comes together to help you grow crops for yourself and for your communities, and helps you enjoy a little bit more of the production that you're already doing. So as noted in the introduction, I'm at the Northwest Washington Research Center in Mount Vernon. So just a ferry ride and a short drive away from you, but it's a whole different world in a lot of ways over here in the Skagit Valley. So I realize that a lot of you have microclimates on your island locations, and you just have to bear with me if what you're experiencing is a little bit different than what I'm experiencing here, but hopefully we're pretty close together, and a lot of this information will be directly applicable to you. So again, just a little bit, there we go. All right, so the topics we're going to talk about today, I just have a list here so you know what to expect. We'll talk about crop pollination because this is going to affect what crops you decide to try to grow for seed and then how you manage those crops. Just some general growing practices. Vegetable crops that you grow for vegetable seed are really the same crops you're growing for vegetables. And so a lot of those practices are going to be exactly the same. And then crops that are easy to save seed from and crops that you have to be a little bit more careful about. And then how to harvest seed and some cleaning steps, and then seed storage. So that's what the talk is about today. And hopefully this is what you expected. So your long wait was worthwhile. So let's start by talking about pollination types. So crops are pollinated in these different ways, and self-pollinated crop, you can see here the first one on my list. These are the crops that are going to be easy to save seed from because the pollen is transferred from within the flower, and there's just, you don't have to rely on pollen transfer. And these are the crops to focus on if seed saving is something that's new to you and you're not quite sure that you want to go through a lot of trouble and a lot of work, then you start with a self-pollinated crop and kind of take it from there. So an example that I listed here is the Fabaceae family. This is the legume family, or the beans, the peas, and we'll talk more about families later, but I just wanted to give you an example of what is an easy crop to save seed from would be beans and peas, which are in the Fabaceae family. So a cross-pollinated crop, that pollen is produced on one flower and then is transported to another flower. And that transportation requires bees, insects, or winds. And there's a lot of opportunity there from pollen contamination. That is to say that pollen from a different plant gets transferred to the plant that you want to save seed from. So these are a little bit more difficult to manage. And examples of those are brassicas and cucurbits, and also Liliaceae, which is the onion family. So if you've had experience with these crops, just know that these crops are just, it's certainly possible to grow seed from these crops, but they're just going to take a little bit more management. And then some terms that I think you should be familiar with: open pollinated, or OP. And these are crops that are often referred to as heirloom crops. So that's the next term there. And they can be either cross-pollinated or self-pollinated. So you have to be a little bit careful when you're growing seed from an OP variety. And I'll show you some examples of these. So open pollinated does not necessarily mean that it's easy to grow seed from, because if it's a cross-pollinated crop, you have to provide some management. And then heirloom is just a term that's used for a crop, a variety that's been around for about 50 years. There's no strict definition to that 50-year designation, but that's about the time frame in general that one thinks of. And so this is just a variety that's been in cultural practice, cultivated by a group of people for 50+ years, and it's just called an heirloom. And then the last term here is one that you've probably heard and you're probably familiar with, and that's a hybrid. And it is noted as an F1. F1 is the first generation, so family one, first family generation. It's a cross between two parents. And if you save seed from a hybrid plant, it's not going to be true to type. It's not going to be the seed of the plant that you saved it from. It's going to differentiate out to those two parent types. So generally speaking, we don't save seed from hybrids because they're not true to type. So here's just some examples for you from open pollinated crops. So these are peas that you might be familiar with: Cascadia, Sugar Ann, etc. And you can see right here that it's noted that for Sugar Ann, for example, but you can see all of these are noted as OPs, and that means it's open pollinated. So that tells you that it can either be a self-pollinated crop or a cross-pollinated crop, but I already told you that peas are a self-pollinated crop. So you're going to have a little bit more information when you read the information that's in your seed catalog. So, in some ways that's a little bit unfortunate, but in other ways, I think it's just part of the joy of being a gardener is you have to read a little bit to know exactly what these terms mean. So you're going to see the term OP in catalogs. It just tells you that it's open pollinated. And then here's an example of tomatoes. There are a lot of tomatoes that are hybrids, and you can see there at the bottom here, this is from Johnny's catalog. And so they tell you F1 means hybrid. And then when you look at the different varieties, they're listed there that these are hybrid varieties because it says in parentheses there F1. So F1 tells you that is a hybrid variety. Now, by law, a variety must list whether or not it's a hybrid. So when you look at any seed packet, any catalog, it has to tell you if it's a hybrid variety, but it doesn't have to tell you if it's not a hybrid variety. So just, I don't know if that's more confusing or not, but if it says F1, you know it's a hybrid. If it says nothing, then all you know is that it's not a hybrid. It could be an open pollinated, a self-pollinated crop. It could be an heirloom, and you don't necessarily know that, but what you know is that it's not a hybrid. So again, I hope that's not too confusing, but I just think it's important that you see that hybrids must be noted on seed packets and catalogs. And those are the varieties you want to stay away from for seed saving because they're not going to be true to type. So let's talk about pollination now. So self-pollinated crops are the crops where the pollen is transferred from within the same flower. And so the seed is just all self-contained, if you will, within that flower. So examples of self-pollinated crops are beans, lettuce, peas, soybean, edamame. Edamame is a soybean, and then tomato. So these are all crops that are easy to grow seed from, easy to save seed from. And so if you're new to seed saving, these are definitely types of crops that you might want to start with. And if you're going to start with a tomato, then don't start with a hybrid tomato, start with an open pollinated or an heirloom tomato. From a cross-pollinated crop, so these are ones where the pollen has to move from one flower to the next. And so that's wind, insects, bees, etc. You can see the list of crops there. And some of these are relatively easy to manage, but some of them are not. And we're going to talk about we're going to talk about several of these crops very specifically as we move through this presentation. But the main point I want to make here is that the self-pollinated crops are very easy to grow seed from, and the cross-pollinated crops are going to require management on your part to make sure that the right pollen gets to the flower that you're collecting the seed from. So now we're just going to talk just general growing procedures. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, a lot of the crops that you grow seed from are going to be grown just as you would grow the vegetable crop, but there are a little bit of differences in some cases, and I'll explain those as we get to them. So first, transplanting. I generally transplant most of the crops I grow just because I gain about 3 to 4 weeks of production with our climate here. So for the most part, I'm doing transplanting for most of my vegetable crops. And the planting schedule for the most part is going to be just as you would be planting for vegetable production. So I usually target a June 1 transplant date for most of my vegetables, certainly the warm season vegetables. If you've got a cool season vegetable, and let's just say something like beans, I'm usually planting beans out in the garden by May 15th at the latest. And you just know what your dates are, where you are, and those are the dates you want to follow. Now, the only exception to this rule is biennials. So a biennial, and we're talking seed production here. So a biennial for seed production, you grow the plant the first year, it needs to overwinter, and then the next year will be producing seed. So for those crops, you're going to plant them in the later summer. They will overwinter as a small plant, and then they'll start growing again in the spring, and then that's when you get seed production. And I'll give you some very specific examples of biennials that you might be wanting to save seed from. Irrigation, for seed saving, we keep irrigation the same as you would for a vegetable crop. And then a few weeks prior to harvest, we stop irrigation. So the crop dries down, the seed dries down, the crop stops growing vegetative matter and just basically starts to shut down. And that'll dry your seed out on the plant and just get you to where you need to be by the end of the growing season. And then we use plastic mulch in most of my production. So again, we're here in Mount Vernon. It warms the soil, it hastens crop maturity, it controls weeds, it keeps the large fruit clean, and it prevents fruit rot. So I just wanted to put that out there, that's what we do here. And if you're interested, we do a lot of work with soil biodegradable plastic mulch. And so there's a good option there if you don't like the idea of plastic. But I'll show you some plastic that we use, and just know that on a gardening perspective, you can reuse that plastic mulch for many, many years, so you don't have to be throwing it away, but just something for you to consider. So this crop calendar is in the home vegetable gardening guide that we wrote a few years ago. It's online, you can access it. I'm just showing it here to give you an idea of the fact that we just follow the same planting guide for vegetable crops for our seed crops. So if you aren't familiar with this guide, please just take a look. It's online. Hopefully everybody has access to that link and you can follow it. So seeding, transplants, seeds so that you're ready to transplant by June 1, and everybody has probably a slightly different growing environment. If you're doing this at home, you're going to know better for you what it takes to get a plant ready to transplant by June 1. For me, tomatoes, for example, you can see on the photograph on the left. And these are, I just wanted to emphasize, these are actually tomatoes that are being prepared for a plant sale. So I don't grow my transplants in pots like that. I use a small cell, we use a 72 cell flat, which you'll see here in another photograph. But for tomatoes, which in my experience are a pretty fast growing plant, it's usually about 3 weeks from seeding to being ready to transplant out. So again, you know that better in your area, exactly what you have. Direct seeding, you can see on the right here, that photograph is of radishes, and it's just an example of what a direct seeded radish looks like. So we direct seed a lot of crops. So the root crops, radishes, onions, carrots, for example, also the legumes, peas and beans, we just direct seed and we don't transplant them. So for biennials, for carrots, leeks, onions, and kale, for example, these are the biennial vegetables that you might be interested in saving seed from. You want to be direct seeding those by late July. So just a quick overview on growing transplants. If this is not something you're familiar with, we use what's called a 72 cell tray. That's the photograph there on the left. And then these domes are usually come with the trays, or if you don't have them, you can use plastic, you can use a box, you can use whatever you like to cover the tray with, but that just retains the moisture. So after you water the tray, you get the seed in the tray, you water it, you put the dome on. I like to crack it open so it's not sealed. So just to allow some aeration, and then you don't have to be worrying about watering it because it retains the moisture. So this is the photograph on the left. This is actually what I do at home. Each one of those pots contains about 6 seeds of tomatoes. Each pot is a different variety. And this is how I germinate my plants at home. So just little pots on a tray in a plastic bag. That plastic bag serves the same function as the dome, retains the moisture. I don't have to water these at all. And then once you start to see the seed germinate, you can just look through the plastic and you can see it, then that pot comes out. I use clear plastic versus black plastic so that I can just look through the plastic and see whether or not my crop is germinating. If you're using black plastic, you have to open it up, take the pots out and take a look. So this is just the easier way to go. And then this is what the cells look like. These are germinated and these plants are almost ready to go out. So you're looking at about 2 true leaves on the transplants, and that's about the smallest I like to put a transplant out. You can certainly get a little bit bigger, but you don't want to let them get too root bound. So that just gives you an idea about growing transplants and the size they need to be to put them out in the garden. And then plastic mulch, as I mentioned, this is what we use. So on the left, that's bulb fennel, and on the right, that is chard. And I use plastic mulch for almost everything I grow here, and for 2 main reasons. One reason is because it warms the soil. It gets us to production a couple of weeks earlier, and in some cases, it gets us to production where otherwise we would not get to production at all because it's just too cool for us. But the other reason I really like plastic mulch is because it maintains a completely weed-free environment there. We do have weeds around the planting hole, one or 2 weedings at the most, and then that whole bed is clear of weeds, so it's really low maintenance. We pull this plastic mulch up, and then for the garden, you can just keep using it over and over again. It's really durable. So it's an investment that I think is worthwhile. Drip irrigation, we drip irrigate all of our crops here at the research center where I work, but also in my garden. Overhead irrigation I know is really easy. It's the least expensive way to irrigate a crop, but when you put water on top of a crop, you end up with wet leaves, and that's where you get all your disease from. So the best way to reduce disease incidence on a crop is to use drip irrigation as opposed to overhead irrigation. So this is just a garden. This is actually up on San Juan Island. You can see the lettuce there, and you can see the setup, the drip tape set up to the garden hose. And on the right, this is a field here in the Anacortes, excuse me, the Mount Vernon area, and you can see peppers. The thing to know about drip tape, if you're going to use drip tape, is it has a hole. That hole is called an emitter, and the spacing of that hole really matters, because if you get a drip tape with a 36-inch spacing and then you put a crop with a 10-inch spacing on it, you're only going to get water every 36 inches. And so it's really important to know if you're getting drip tape, what the emitter spacing is, and then to line the crop up with that emitter spacing so that the water gets delivered right to the crop. So back to crops and seed saving. Lettuce is a very easy crop to save seeds from, and we'll get into some very specifics about this for each one of these crops. The flower, even though it's an open pollinated crop, the flower remains open for only a few minutes, and so generally all the pollen flow is within the same flower. So lettuce is a very easy crop to save seed from, and something that I would certainly encourage you to try. The Solanaceous family, I have another slide here that's going to show you these families if you're not familiar with it, but this is the tomato family and some other crops. And for tomatoes, the flowers open after the pollen has been released and pollinated. And so the flower is closed while the pollen is moving as it needs to move for pollination. So when it opens up, you've already had pollination occur. So this is what makes tomatoes a very easy crop to save seeds from. Fabaceae family, again, the legumes, these are self-pollinated. So these are the beans, the peas, and so they're self-pollinated, very easy to save seed from. If you've got multiple varieties of these same crops in your garden and you're wanting to save seed from multiple varieties of the same crop, then generally the recommendation is to keep those varieties 20 feet apart in the garden to prevent any cross-pollination events. So just be aware that cross-pollination can happen. And so if you want to be absolutely sure to keep your varieties separate for seed saving, a 20-foot separation is what's recommended. So this just gives you the list of families if it's something you're not familiar with. And again, this is in our home vegetable gardening publication, excuse me, it's online, so you can get it from online. It's just something I think you should be familiar with. So when we say the Brassica family, the Crucifer family, just know what's in there. Broccoli, cabbage, etc. is in the Brassica family. Chenopodiaceae family, this is beets, chard, and spinach. Cucurbits, cucumbers, melons, pumpkins, etc. Fabaceae, this may be a name that's still maybe new to some of you. It used to be the legume family, but it was renamed, goodness, probably 20, 30 years ago. So hopefully it's a name that you're familiar with. So this is beans and peas, soybean, Liliaceae, garlic, leeks, onions, chives, as you can see there, asparagus, which might be a surprise to you, and etc. Solanaceous family, this is tomatoes, which is probably of most interest to people, but also eggplant, pepper, potatoes, etc. So if you're not familiar with these names, you can just download this from our online publication and you can have this as your guide. So we're going to just start walking through seed saving for a couple of these crops just to give you some ideas of how to do this. And we're going to start with lettuce. So lettuce bolts. Bolting is the term for flowering for a crop like this where the flower stalk kind of comes straight up out of the plant. So lettuce bolts, cabbage bolts. Tomatoes does not bolt because that flower is on the stem, as you're very familiar with it. So bolting is a term that's used when the whole flower stalk emerges from the base of the plant. So bolting, the flower stalk emerges when temperatures go very high or when we have very long days. Now, as far north as we are, we do tend to have very long days, but because our temperatures don't go up really high, we tend not to get a lot of flowering with our lettuce. So not every lettuce variety is going to flower in our area. So just be aware that that might be a limiting factor for you to save seed from some of the varieties. So some cultivars will bolt when the days start to get shorter. And you're going to figure this out as you grow these different varieties. This is the photograph that you see here. This is in my garden. I just had a whole mixture of different varieties. And you can see the plant in the center here is bolting and none of the others are. So sometimes you're just going to have to get a feel for what's going to work for you. And then those are the varieties you may just focus on. So bolting usually occurs a few weeks after peak harvest and late July or early August in our area. And then this photo I'm taking here is actually taken in February, March. So these are overwintering lettuces, and one of those varieties bolted coming out of the cold winter. So this is what flowering lettuce looks like. You may have seen it already, and for most of us, it's when the plant starts to flower, then we're looking at lettuce production for the vegetable part, and that lettuce head is no longer any good because it turns really bitter. But if you're growing lettuce for seed, then this is definitely what you want to see. So the picture on the left is the lettuce in full flower here. The flowers are open, and you can see the top right. It almost looks like a dandelion. It's got a little bit of I'm sorry, I don't know what the right word here is to describe what the fluffiness is. But basically, it gets caught by the wind, it gets carried by the wind, and that's how it disseminates its seed. So when you're saving lettuce seed, you want to be cutting that stalk and getting it, oops, excuse me, this auto advanced for me, didn't mean to do that. So you want to be getting it into a bag before they start to be wind dispersed. And the photograph on the right, excuse me, on the bottom right here is from my garden. And what I do is I just bend that lettuce plant, the lettuce head over just with my hands, I rub the seed onto the soil surface, lightly rake it in, and then that's the seed germinating directly in my garden. So I don't actually save the seed and take it out of my garden. I actually just replant it directly from the mother plant directly into my garden, and then I transplant those around the garden. So couple of different ways to think about seed saving. Tomato seed is definitely a little bit more complicated. If you haven't tried tomato, it's not that hard. It just takes attention to detail. And so you want to be collecting the fruit when it's ripe, slice it in half, scoop out the seeds, place it in a jar. That's the top photograph on the right. Add about a cup of water to get that seed floated. Cover with cheesecloth or paper towel. You want to have aeration here, so don't use plastic because then it'll go anaerobic. You don't want that. Put it in a warm spot, nice warm place in the kitchen or someplace that's nice and warm, and then allow it to sit for several days. It's going to ferment a little bit, and what that does is that removes the gel sac from the seed, and that gel sac contains inhibitors. It contains growth inhibitors, sprouting inhibitors, and you need to get that off the seed. So allow it to ferment for a couple of days. A slight a mold layer is going to form on the top. You just take that off, clean the seed, sift it, and then put it onto a paper plate and allow it to dry. So really not that complicated, but the fermentation step is a necessary step just to clean that seed and get that gel layer off, which will otherwise inhibit germination. Beans, again, probably the easiest crop you could grow seed from. So these are beans in my plots here at Mount Vernon. And then you can see on the right here, just beans in a pod. Once those pods start to turn yellow and the bean is fully formed in the pod, then you can save seed from that plant. And you just need to get the pods off early enough because otherwise the pod does split and all that seed gets thrown to the ground. So just don't let the pod get too dry on the plant because it's going to open up and you're going to lose the seed to the ground. And this is how we do bean seed in our plots here in Mount Vernon because we grow a lot of beans. So you can see the photograph on the left. What we've done is we've just pulled the plants out from the ground, just put them into this burlap bag, and then we dry them separately. Now we have a dryer here in Mount Vernon, so we just stick them into a seed dryer, and that's, it's certainly very easy, but it's not many people are going to have access to that. So the photograph on the right is me drying my bean plants at home. So this is on my driveway on a blue tarp. I just piled all the plants there because I wanted to see if I could do it, and indeed we can. And so just pile all the plants like that on the blue tarp, a nice hot place like the driveway. You need to turn the plants probably a couple of times a day because otherwise all the moisture accumulates at the bottom of that plastic and the bean plants will mold. If it starts to rain or if you've got very humid conditions, just move them into the garage or a covered area, and you can move them back and forth as long as it takes to get those plants as dry as you can to start getting the seed out. And then here, what we do in my program is the photograph on the left. This is Carolyn, a master gardener who used to work with me many years ago. And this is what we call our bean stomp. And so the beans are back in that burlap bag, and then we just walk on them lightly. Don't jump and, don't make too much of an impact, but we just walk on them. And what that does is that just takes the beans out of the pod. So it's the easiest way that I know to thresh a bean. And then we pour them onto our compost screen. So this is a compost screen just turned upside down. And then with our hands there, and I definitely recommend wearing gloves and a mask. And now everybody has masks, so that's not a problem anymore. Because the bean plant does get very dry and it does, gets in your face and you can inhale it, and it is kind of annoying to do that. So the mask is there because of the dust that comes from the plant as you clean the seed. And then we just rub those pods over the compost screen. The beans fall through the compost screen and all the plant debris just take off and compost it or move it out to the garden, however you're going to manage it. So the next step is just cleaning that seed. So on the left, you can see we have a seed screening frame here. We actually built all of our screens, but I'll show you a photograph here with some screens that are available for purchase. Make sure I put that in here, and I did. Okay, so that's our next slide. And so I just use a box fan. So this is just a box fan. We hold our screen over that, and you want to be really careful with your distance because if you're too close, it's going to blow the seed off. But you just, start really far away and move closer. And what that fan does is it just blows all that light debris off of your seed, and you have nice clean seed that you want to be putting in your bag and saving. And then this is just a collection of screens that we use. So the 1/2-inch screen is our compost screen. And you can see that the 2 green screens there, we just purchased those locally, just to show that you can get purchase supplies, but we make all of our screens with the mesh size that we want for the different crops that we're growing. All right, so I'm going to move on to some crops that are a little bit more difficult to save seed from, but crops that you probably are interested in. So the Cucurbit family. So this is again melons and cucumbers, squash, brassica family. And let's just talk about each one of these as we go here. So Cucurbit family, you have male and female flowers. And so the pollen needs to be transferred. And so this is a really important step that has to occur. And it's very doable, but just understand that if you've got different varieties of the same crop in your garden, you're going to end up with cross-pollination. So if you're going to be saving seed, just plant one variety, one crop of cucurbits, and it's just going to be a lot easier to be seed saving that way. The same thing with the brassica family. There's an open pollinated, and once that wind starts going, that pollen gets moved really fast and just faster than you can possibly imagine. The Liliaceae family, these are onions. They're biennial, so you plant in 1 year and you're going to be harvesting seed the next year. So separation for crops that fall into these category is 1 mile. So you can see that cross-pollination is something that happens very, very quickly, very easily. And so if you're very serious about this, you might want to think about caging or bagging your flowers to make sure that they don't get cross-pollinated. So let's start with the Cucurbit family and cucumbers. Basically, you're going to have to allow them. You're either going to be physically moving pollen yourself, or you only have one variety in your garden and you just hope that that's the variety that your plant gets pollinated with. And so then you leave your fruit on the plant for about 2 to 3 weeks after eating maturity. So the color is going to start to change to yellow or orange. And then you take it off your plant, cut it in half, scoop out the seeds, place in a jar, just as we've walked through for tomatoes, exactly the same. And you can see the same steps here. So cucumber seeds saved in exactly the same way that you save tomato seed. Summer squash, a lot easier. You're familiar with zucchini. You just leave on the plant until the rind hardens, and then you process in the same way. But a lot of zucchini seed is hard shelled, and so it may not need the processing that for the soft shelled seed, and that's something you're just going to have to get a feel for as you go. So that's your zucchini plants. Winter squash, probably the easiest thing that you can save seed from. So harvest when they're ready to eat, just store them in, I store all my winter squash in my garage. It's an unheated structure connected to the house, so it doesn't get freezing cold, but it's not heated. And I store them for the entire winter. And then in about another month or so, that seed is ready for me to just take out of the fruit and just dry it, and it's ready to go. Melons, so cantaloupe, watermelons, if you're interested in this, you leave the fruit on the plant for about 1 to 2 weeks after eating maturity, scoop out the seed, wash by hand, and dry on a paper plate. So again, very easy to do. So the big key here to saving seed from cucurbit seed is just making sure that the pollination happens in the way that you want it to happen. If you've got multiple varieties of the same crop, you're going to get cross-pollination. You can certainly save the seed, but it's, who knows what the next plant that you grow will look like. So cucurbit flowers, as I mentioned, you've got male and female flowers, and hopefully you can see the male flower there is just a straight pedicel up to the blossom, and the female flower has this ovule that's already formed under the blossom, and that ovule is there even when the flower emerges. So you can easily see the difference between male and female flowers. So when you're processing small dry seed, I just wanted to go through the steps here for you, and then you can apply this to any seed like lettuce seed, brassica seeds. They're all, they have their seed formed on the top of a stalk, and you can process them all the same way. So the first thing you do is you just cut the stalk, place it upside down in a paper bag, and then place that bag in a dry place for a few weeks to let it dry down. Then use your hands to rub the seed off into the bag. You might want to be wearing gloves, especially for the brassica crops, the broccoli, kale, etc., because those edges do get really sharp and they can really cut your hands. And then you just pour the seed through a small screen to screen off the larger debris, and that screen size is going to really just be targeted to your seed size, and that's something you're just going to have to become familiar with. You can use a hair dryer. So just as I used a box fan dryer for my beans, you can use a hair dryer for these small seeds. Just be very, very cautious. Don't start really far away so that you don't blow the seed off, because that seed is going to be very light and very easy to blow off. So just be really careful with this. Other than that, you can just blow with your mouth to get that small debris off. So just walking through a couple of these crops. This is kale. It's red Russian kale on the right, and I apologize, that's not red Russian kale on the left, but that's okay. It's all kale. And you can see that it forms this really tall seed stalk on the left. You can still see some flowers there. And so you get this tall seed stalk. And when that seed pod dries down, it will open up and that seed will get thrown to the ground. So you want to be cutting that stalk and stick it into that paper bag before it gets too dry, because otherwise you'll lose part of the seed. What I do with my kale, and that's the photograph on the right, is I just bend the stalk down to the ground. Again, with my hands, I just break the seed stalks open, I rake it in lightly, and then you can see on the right here, that's all that red Russian kale that came up from a seed stalk. And then I just transplant that around my garden. A lot of it just goes into my salad bowl or my pot, if you will, and it's just a young green. Because I don't want all of those plants in my garden. So I eat what I don't want to transplant, and I transplant what I do around the garden, and I have my next crop ready to go. So a couple of key notes about kale. It is a biennial crop, so it overwinters as a young plant, and then it starts to flower in the spring. So this is different than when you're growing kale as a vegetable plant. When you're growing kale as a vegetable, you're planting it in the spring and you're harvesting it in the early summer. But when you're growing it as a vegetable crop, we plant it in the fall, or excuse me, late July or thereabouts, let it overwinter, and then come spring, it's going to start to flower. It is open pollinated, so be very careful if you're growing any other brassica crops, it will open pollinate it. I actually lost my red Russian kale crop many years ago now to a mustard, a Japanese mustard. And so it still looked like kale, but it was hot and spicy, which I did not like. So I had to start all over again. So just be careful when you're growing brassica crops, because they will readily cross-pollinate. The pods shatter, which means the seed does get thrown to the ground. So make sure you get them out of the garden fast enough before you lose a lot of your seed. And then again, we just cut the stalks, put it in a bag, and go from there. Broccoli is a relatively easy plant to grow seed from. And this method I'm going to give you is going to hopefully allow it to be flowering at a time where there are very few other brassica crops flowering in your garden space. So what I do is I grow my broccoli, I harvest the head, the main head just goes as a vegetable crop. And then what you'll see is all these sprouts start to emerge from the leaf axils. And that's what you see here on the left. You see the sprouts emerging, and on the right, you can see those sprouts are flowering. So this flowering is going to occur at the end of the season. So September, October. And by that time, hopefully a lot of your other brassicas are done and they're out. So this will give you broccoli flowering at a time when hopefully there's not cross-pollination going on. So now we're going to move on to onions. Onions are a biennial plant, so you're going to be planting them in the late summer, allow them to overwinter. The overwintering size is actually important, and the target there is about pencil size. So you want the stem of the onion to be about pencil size going into the winter time. That's because the plant needs to be vernalized, and vernalization is the biological process that initiates the flower stalk. And so you need that to occur in order for the flower stalk to emerge. So a vernalized plant coming out in the spring the flower stalk will be initiated and it'll emerge in the early summer. It's ready to harvest when the umbel, the flowering head, turns brown. And again, just as I described earlier, you cut the stalk, stick it into a paper bag, and process it that way. So this is what the plant looks like going into the winter. So there's your pencil there next to the plant. That's the ideal size for an onion going into the winter. And then this is what you want that plant to look like in the early summer. You've got that flower stalk there. This is called an umbel. And here, this is fresh. You can see that the covering is just coming off here. So they're just being pollinated. That'll all go brown. And before it gets too brown and dry, cut it and stick it in your paper bag. So let's talk about carrots. They're another biennial plant. So again, you need to overwinter the plants. If it's freezing cold and you get severe freezing damage, you're going to have to take the roots out of the ground, store them, and then replant them in the spring. But for the most part here, even with the snow cover we had this winter, you can overwinter a carrot crop in the garden for a seed crop. So they are open pollinated. And what this means is that something like Queen Anne's lace, if you've got it as a weed around you, will cross pollinate onions. So that's just something to be aware of. The flower stalk will emerge in early summer. The umbel turns brown. Cut the stalks a few inches below the head. And then again, put those in your bag and process them as we already discussed earlier. So this is what carrots look like. The top picture there, that is actually a carrot crop on San Juan Island. So that's a vegetable crop, but it's direct seeded. You can go ahead and harvest baby carrots if you like. Leave as many as you like to grow your carrot seed crop. So just leave those in the ground. And you can see the snow cover here on the top center photograph. The carrots will do fine just through all of that. But if you do get worried, you can dig them up. These are just it's a black bulb crate. That tends to be what we work with here. Are these bulb crates? We get a lot of bulb crates because of the bulb industry. But anyways, you can just stick the carrots in here like this, put them in a nice cold place for the rest of the winter, transplant them back out, and then they will flower. And you can see what the flower looks like. If you're familiar with Queen Anne's lace looks similar, but it's more flattened. And then on the bottom right, you can see the dried flower. So you want to cut that stalk and get it into your paper bag before you start to lose the seed, because they will blow away, they will drop away. So just cut it before it gets too dry. So now we're going to move into seed storage. So now you've got all your seed, and now you need to save it, and you need to make sure that it stays viable so you can replant it out. And so you got two environmental factors to consider. The first one is temperature, and the second one is moisture. Temperature for us is actually very easy. You don't have to do too much. Our day-to-day temperature here year round is just fine for storing seed. So the biggest issue we have is humidity. We have a very humid climate, and seed, to store seed for a long time, it needs to be dried down to about 12% moisture. And our ambient humidity here in our area is anywhere from about 75% to 99% most days, most of the year. So keeping that seed in an airtight container is going to be really critical to maintaining your seed quality and viability over time. So you need to store it in a dry place without humidity. You can use drying packs that you get with equipment, for example, but you can also buy drying medium from different companies if you like. You can also store it in a sealed container. It absolutely has to be sealed if you're going to put it in a refrigerator, because a refrigerator humidity is about 40%. So that airtight container is really important for storing seed here. So this is just what you can expect for viability. Viability is just how long that seed is going to stay alive for you. So, and you can see that in general, the time frame here is really short. Now, the reality is you can save seed for a lot longer than this if you have really good conditions. But this is what you can expect in general. So the point is, don't get disappointed if you save your seed and a couple of years later you find it's not germinating for you. Just understand that in general, seed doesn't have a long storage life. It's the pleasant mistakes in history that have given us seed that's been stored for thousands of years. So if you're familiar with the stories, seed recovered from the pyramids and seed recovered from caves, and found to be still alive. Well, what about those environments make that so? It's incredibly dry, it's dark, there's no moisture. The temperature is the same temperature year round. And it's cool. And so that's what gives long seed storage life. That's definitely not the normal circumstances that all of us have. So just be aware that seed storage life is generally not that long. So you're not going to be saving seed for 5 or 10 years for the most part. So you might want to think about refreshing your seed every year or two. Again, that's all part of the experience and the joy of being a seed saver, right? Is seeing what you can do. So with all of that said, and depending on your interest, I just want you to know that there is this great book available to you. It's called Seed to Seed. It's from the Seed Savers Exchange out of the Midwest. And I'm going to say Ohio, and I hope I have that right. But this is a great book, and it just goes through most of the crops that you probably want to save seeds of. It does have a lot of focus on grain crops, as you can see here, corn and lentils and other crops, but a lot of vegetables are in here. And with the key steps to saving seeds from vegetables that you can then apply to other vegetables. And so if you're really interested in saving seed, this is probably the best seed saving book that I'm familiar with. Seed to Seed from Seed Savers Exchange. I believe it's still available. I've had my copy for, goodness, probably 35 years now. And it's just a great resource to have. So with that, I know it's been a long time getting to this presentation. And so if we have questions, I'll be very willing and able to answer now. And if you have questions that you want to ask later, they can be emailed to me, and we can certainly talk about it later. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and see if we have time for questions.
Thank you, Carol. We do have a few questions, and let me get them here in front of me. The first question is, when the seeds have germinated and plants on a warming pad, do you water them from above or below?
Okay, so you're growing transplants, if I understand correctly. So transplants on a warming pad, water from above or below. Great question. I like to water my seeds. You can either, so just so everybody's clear on this, when we're talking about below, what that means is lifting the tray up and putting the water in the flat, the tray underneath the flat. That's, as I understand it, watering from below. And watering it from above would be putting the water directly onto the soil or the plant in the tray. I water all my transplants from above just because I have a lot of transplants that we're growing, and there's no way that I'm going to be lifting up each and every flat. So you can certainly get very good success by watering from above. And the challenge to water, or the issue to be aware of when you're watering from above, is if you get wet foliage and you have any disease, you can get disease in your seedling production, and you can lose seeds. So the key there is really just don't overwater your seedlings. Don't overwater your transplants, because that's where your rotting comes from, is if you've got too much water there in the system.
The next question is, what growing medium do you use to plant in?
I use a mix from Sunshine. So we just purchase all of our grow medium. So we use Sunshine medium, and there is small seeded small mix, and there is large seeded mix. So you can go either way. I get the small seeded mix, and that way I can use it for everything and I don't worry about it. The large seeded mix for seedling production tends to be clumpy, and the small seeds get lost in there, and they can really just kind of fall down farther in your cell than you want them to go, because there's all these air channels there. So I get the small seeded mix I use Sunshine, but really any potting mix can work. The thing to think about there is whether or not it has fertilizer in it. So if it has no fertilizer in it, just be aware that your transplant has a couple of weeks, and that's going to have no nutrition. So you're going to have to add fertilizer to it. So the mix I have has a starter fertilizer mixed into it.
And Alice says she uses the seeding mix from Stuber's.
Yep.
And adds extra perlite to lighten it up.
Yeah, we also purchase our mix from Stuber's, but I just buy a branded name. So, yep.
And we don't.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to just say this for everybody. If you didn't know, Stuber's is going out of business. So if you didn't know that, and if that's where you get your supplies, just be aware that the situation is going to change.
Thank you for the heads up. Another question came in. Can you address the difference between organic versus inorganic seeds? And is it important to buy organic?
So organic is a certification through USDA. So certified organic is something that it would take a lot of time for me to explain exactly what it is. And so I think people tend to explain it by what it is not. And what it is not, it does not include the use of synthetic chemicals. So that would be pesticides or fertilizers in the production of an organic crop. So I would say that's a question really up to you as individuals as to whether or not organic is something that is important to you. So organic seed is going to be is produced from an organic crop. The seed quality is going to be, it should be the same. Certainly if you're buying it from a commercial source, there are requirements for seed quality, germination, cleanliness, etc. Seed. The big issue you have to be really aware of is whether or not you've got any disease issues that are seed-borne. So just, I would say what's important is making sure you get your seed from a reputable place that is disease-free, because the last thing you want is to be bringing disease into your garden on your seed crop. Sorry, Carol, you're muted.
Thank you. I got the big thing saying, you're muted. How can I stop my seedlings from getting too leggy, especially broccoli and the Brussels sprouts?
Yeah, so that's just basically a lack of light. So you need more light. So that's a challenge for us, right? If we're growing seedlings in the spring, transplants in the spring, so you can just, get a grow light and put your seedlings under grow lights if you can. That's what we do in the greenhouse for sure. Just basically, it's just giving it as much light exposure as you can. That's the lack of light is what results in that legginess.
Another question, given the late frost date, do you recommend putting transplants out earlier with floating row covers?
Yeah, so you can definitely use floating row covers. So again, just so everybody knows, row covers come in several different qualities. So there's row cover as an insect barrier. It's incredibly lightweight and you're not going to get any temperature protection out of that. And then you've got row cover that's advertised as a frost barrier. And I think the heaviest row cover that you can get, I think it's going to increase your temperature by about 7 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not a huge amount, but it's generally enough to keep off an early frost. So absolutely row covers can be used. Definitely something that I use quite a bit in my garden. So yes, that's a good way to go.
Next question, does ethylene, let's say from apples, affect the viability of seeds?
Good question. The answer is no, to the best of my knowledge. So I guess I'm struggling with thinking storing seed with apples. And so hopefully you're not storing your seed with apples anyway. So I'm going to just put that out there. So hopefully your seed is going to be in little packets, envelopes, whatever, and staple them. We use staples just because it's fold them over and staple them because it's easy to take the staples out. And then just keep them in a shoebox or whatever it is on a shelf or wherever you like it. And just don't put your apples in the box. So ethylene, you shouldn't have ethylene in the same place as you're storing your seed, I would hope.
Bad news about Stubers. Where are you going to go to shop locally now?
Good question. And so right now there is, and gosh, the name is escaping me, down in Fife, so South Seattle, there's a commercial place down there. And we are looking around right now to find out if there's something more local for us. So I know Bellingham, there might be something in Bellingham, and I'm looking in North Seattle.
How can we identify brassica varieties to plant for spring, fall, or winter when they are not tagged as such in the catalogs?
So I'm sorry, I missed the, how can we identify them that are what?
Brassica varieties?
Yep.
To plant for spring, fall, or winter when they are not tagged as such in the catalogs.
Okay, so good question. I think that's going to come from experience from yourself and from the gardeners around you, your community around you. But I also say, look at your different catalogs. So different catalogs have different information. I personally find Territorial, for example, has a lot of really growing information for our area. And I think that they give more information about what varieties are suitable for what season. And that's probably where I would start. I would also maybe just look online and just, do some keyword searches, like if you know what brassica crop you're interested in, and let's just put kale out there as one, kale for summer production, kale for spring production, and just see what pulls up. But I have to say that I'm one that firmly believes in a personal experience. So just plant some different varieties and see what grows best for you in your area. And that's what you're probably going to work with. I would say for kale, for example, for me, I only grow red Russian kale. I find red Russian kale is just stable for me. No matter when I grow it, it's just really productive and I like it. So I think you're going to have to figure out for each one of you what works best for you in your own garden space.
You have to dry saved seed to replant.
Yes, well, I'm going to say yes, because generally you're not directly replanting it. So the seed, even when I bent, like with the examples I showed you, the kale and the lettuce examples I showed you, I bent the head down and put the seed in the ground. The seed did not immediately germinate because the temperature wasn't right. So what happens is the seed stays there until the temperature is right, and then it germinates. So if the seed is green at that point, if it's not dried, it's going to rot. And so the dry seed is going to give you some longevity. So the answer to that question is yes, you want a dry seed for any type of seed saving.
That was the last question I see in chat. Or Nita?
Okay. Carol, thank you. I just saw such a wealth of information. What I'm going to take away, probably sort of as the central thing, is see what you can do. And using all of the ideas that you've given us, there are so many things that we can do, but I really appreciate this. And so appreciate your patience with us today, you and everyone who's listening. And I'm so glad that we got to hear your presentation. If you are listening and you want to hear a recording of the presentation, it'll probably be 5 days to a week before it's posted, but it will be up both on the library website and on the Orcas Island Garden website. So Karen, I thank you. Carol, I'm sorry. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I think you also have my slide presentation. So if there are particular slides that people want, you've got them. And I hope I didn't go too fast. I felt like given the time constraint and everything, I felt like maybe I was rushing, but I hope that wasn't too fast for everybody.
I think it was really clear, and I think people can follow, and they can go back and listen to parts if they want to hear it again. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody, and
Okay.
Happy seed saving.
Okay, Dixie is going to say something quickly, and then Nita, and then we're out of here.
Thank you, Carol. This has been tremendous. And I also noticed that you have great resources in the chat. There was a link, and so I've already downloaded that to my drive to share with our Lopez Island Garden Club members. And the Orcas Island Library also has, if you can believe it, also has an ability to go into that link that you can find on chat with all of the seed starting books that Orcas Island Library has. So thank you, Orcas Island Library. Now, the great news is we all are going to take this information that you've shared with us today, Carol, and get ready for our in-person, face-to-face plant sale, Mother's Day weekend. So we've got the catalogs, we've got the information, we've got the links, we have the enthusiasm to meet together in May for our plant sale, working in a concert with the Lopez Island School Garden. So I guess I would say to all of you, get your seeds, plant your seeds, start your starts, and get ready for our plant sale. Thank you all.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, everyone. On behalf of the Orcas Island our Garden Club, I want to thank you all. I want to thank Carol Miles for a great presentation, Carol DePogny from the library for her captaining our Zoom presentation today. Like Henry David Thoreau said, convince me that you have a seed there, and I am prepared to expect wonders. After today, I am ready for wonders. So go out and enjoy, and thank you all. Our next program is going to be on February 16 with Jennifer Harris. So mark your calendars, and we'll see you then. Thank you so much.